Americans owe a lot to the Pilgrims, but we officially celebrate Thanksgiving due to a man who came much later. In 1858, American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, himself a descendant of multiple Pilgrims and Mayflower passengers, wrote The Courtship of Myles Standish. The poem described a love triangle between Myles Standish, John Alden, and Priscilla Mullins, set against the backdrop of an Indian war. In the poem, Myles is portrayed as a strong but timid military man who is in love with Priscilla. As a favor to his friend, John goes to Priscilla and explains the love that Myles holds for her. John's romantic eloquence leads to Priscilla replying, "Why don't you speak for yourself, John?" The poem ends with John and Priscilla marrying, but remaining dear friends with Myles. The romantic and heroic nature of the poem made it an overnight sensation in both the New World and the Old. It sold over 25,000 copies in just 2 months in the United States, and allegedly over 10,000 in a single day in London. The poem elevated the Pilgrims to a near legendary status, and pushed them to the forefront of American culture. Just 5 years after publication, President Abraham Lincoln declared a national and official Thanksgiving holiday in 1863. The Pilgrims became a foundational symbol of unity that Lincoln hoped would help soothe the tensions of the ongoing Civil War. John and Myles and Priscilla were all very real people who came to the New World on the Mayflower. Without their resilience and commitment to survival, America would not be here today. John Alden was born sometime in 1598 in England, possibly in either Harwich or Southampton. By trade, he was a cooper, a maker and fixer of barrels and casks. At the age of 21, he was hired by Captain Christopher Jones as a crew member aboard the Mayflower for an exciting journey into the New World. En route to North America, despite being a member of the crew, John Alden made the decision to stay with the settlers upon arrival. Historians posit that a young John was likely an orphan, leaving nothing behind in England, or that he had already begun to fall in love with his future wife, Priscilla Mullins. Despite his humble beginnings as a cooper, John would go on to hold many prestigious positions within the colony, including treasurer and deputy governor, as well as serving on multiple committees. Like John, Myles Standish was a member of the crew, not a pilgrim. Born in 1584, likely in Lancashire, England, Myles Standish was an English military officer hired by the Pilgrims as an advisor. A veteran of the 80 Years' War, Standish had risen to the rank of captain before being hired by the Pilgrims. He was actually their second choice, after the famed explorer and adventurer Captain John Smith of Pocahontas fame commanded too high a price. Myles devoted his entire life to the defense of Plymouth Colony. He was an active soldier for over 20 years and remained commander of the militia for another 16 years until his death in 1656. Threats to the colony included Native Americans, the French, and even other English colonies, but Myles was there every time. Especially outside of the northeastern United States, the names of John Alden and Myles Standish have been mostly forgotten. And what a shame that is, for they should be held in the same regard as the Founding Fathers for their contributions to what would become America. Their contributions will be the main portion of today's video. For beginners, there is no real evidence to indicate that a love triangle existed between the two men and Priscilla Mullins. While not impossible, when John likely began courting Priscilla, Myles was still married to his first wife, Rose Handley. Rose unfortunately passed away in 1621 during the first winter that the Pilgrims faced. John married Priscilla in 1622 while Myles was still in mourning. A year later, in 1623, Myles married his second and final wife, Barbara. By all accounts, John and Myles were best friends. Before both were married, they lived together as roommates in the colony. Once they had both taken wives, they moved their families outside of the main colony and established the community of Duxbury, which is still around today. Duxbury was likely named by Myles Standish after his ancestral home of Duxbury Hall in England. While Myles Standish was the true military man to his core, John was also a member of the militia alongside his friend when needed. When Myles passed away, his widow Barbara chose John Alden to account for and to distribute his final will and testament. The two families lived close together, and they often intermarried, beginning with the union of John's daughter Sarah and Myles' second son and heir, Alexander. School children today, if at all, learn a very streamlined version of the events regarding Plymouth Colony. However, it is a story of great nuance, perseverance, and faith. The Mayflower and the Pilgrims were actually initially bound for the English colony of Virginia. The voyage was financed by a London-based organization called the Merchant Adventurers. In exchange for funding the voyage and the supplies needed, the Pilgrims would develop a fur trading industry in the New World for the Merchant Adventurers. Upon arrival in the New World, a great storm, perhaps a divine one, made it impossible for the Pilgrims to reach Virginia, instead settling in Massachusetts. The Pilgrims realized that while they still owed a debt, the previous agreement with the Merchant Adventurers was now moot, as the provisions were all about specific lands in Virginia. In response, the Pilgrims developed the Mayflower Compact, a social contract renewing their commitment to God, country, and the creation of a successful colony. I urge all to read the entire work, but here is an excerpt. In the name of God, Amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. We do by these presents, solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation, and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. Both John Alden and Myles Standish signed the compact, signaling their rising status in the colony. In 1626, nearly 6 years into the establishment of Plymouth Colony, the Merchant Adventurers whom financed the operation disbanded. The colony was mostly self-sufficient at this point, but still owed a significant debt for the initial voyage. 8 men of the colony made a decision that not only perpetuated Plymouth Colony, but was also likely the first step towards the establishment of the United States. They took on the debt themselves, and in return, these 8 men received a monopoly on the local fur trade. They became known as the great undertakers of the colony for their service, and included John Alden, Myles Standish, Isaac Allerton, William Brewster, William Bradford, John Howland, Thomas Prence, and Edward Winslow. If you're American, these are your first founding fathers. Howland, Prence, Winslow, and Bradford would all serve as governors and deputy governors multiple times. William Brewster was the colony's elder and spiritual leader. Isaac Allerton was a merchant by trade and was the actual person who traveled back to England to negotiate the undertaking of the debt. All were of great importance to the colony, but I've singled out John Alden and Myles Standish for a few reasons. Above all, their story is a quintessential American one, and the values and principles that these 2 men lived by set the framework for the modern American mythology. Regardless of identity politics, Americans tend to value independence, self-sufficiency, martial status, and hard work, all key qualities needed in pursuit of the so-called American dream. Unlike the other great undertakers, John and Myles did not come from high-born English houses. They were not great spiritual leaders, nor did they have family fortunes. They were members of the crew, a lowly barrel maker and a simple soldier. What they did have was the aforementioned set of values that led them to prominence, both all the way to the deputy governorship. John and Myles developed what I would call a tactic of the hand and sword. John pursued influence through political craftwork, while Myles relied upon his martial ability as a soldier. John served as a committee member on the colony's Council of War, which decided how to use the militia commanded by Myles. This initial joint handshake of power was the first step in their journey towards eventual prominence within the colony. From this position, John continually moved forward, working as assistant to the governor, treasurer, and then finally deputy governor. While John worked as an influential hand in politics, Myles honed his sword. Captain Standish was likely the first person to exit the Mayflower and step foot on land in the New World. With a group of 18 men, Captain Standish explored the shore of Cape Cod and discovered the exact spot where the Pilgrims would settle. In what became known as the First Encounter, approximately 30 Nauset Indians of the Wampanoag Confederacy attacked the shore camp in the middle of the night. Most of the men began to panic, but Captain Standish was able to calm them and instructed them to only fire their matchlock muskets if absolutely necessary. This first show of military prowess led the colony to formally electing Standish as commander of the militia, a position which he held for the rest of his life. In the first winter, where half of the colonists perished, including his first wife, Captain Standish was one of the few not to fall ill. He tended to many of the sick, and future Governor William Bradford later wrote that he was a source of strength during this hard time. Myles was then essential to establishing relations with the local Native Americans. Despite the initial First Encounter skirmish, a representative of the Wampanoag Confederacy soon made peaceful contact. Samoset, an English-speaking Abenaki, explained that the Wampanoag Confederacy was at war with the Massachusetts and Narragansett tribes. Samoset, as a representative of the Wampanoag paramount chief Massasoit, offered peace and trade in exchange for assistance battling their enemies. Captain Standish preferred to show force if it meant avoiding using force. After demonstrating his might as a soldier, Massasoit recognized Standish as a warrior, and a treaty was created. Plymouth Colony may not have survived without the assistance and knowledge of the Wampanoag Confederacy, and the reverse is same as well. Only 5 months after the creation of the treaty, a threat arose. Corbitant, a lower chief under Massasoit, wished to succeed him and separate from the English, even if it meant the destruction of the tribe at the hands of the Narragansett. Massasoit and Governor William Bradford sent 2 trusted warriors to parley with Corbitant. Tisquantum, better known today as Squanto, and Hobbamock. Upon arrival to Corbitant's village, what is today known as Middleborough, Massachusetts, Squanto and Hobbamock were immediately taken captive with the intention of execution. Hobbamock was able to escape and warn his tribe as well as Plymouth. Captain Standish mustered a group of 10 men and immediately went to Squanto's rescue. Corbitant had already fled, but this show of force convinced him that the Wampanoags truly had the support of the English. Corbitant and 9 other previously dissenting chiefs then pledged loyalty to King James. Captain Standish would go on to lead many battles against the Massachusetts tribe. He became lifelong dear friends with Hobbamock, who later converted to Christianity and joined the Standish household, being buried on Standish's land when he died in 1642. In a lesser-known but interesting event in Standish's career, Plymouth Colony had a minor skirmish with a fellow English colony. In 1625, a different group of English established the colony of Marymount, which is now Quincy, Massachusetts. Diametrically opposed to the Pilgrims of Plymouth, the settlers of Marymount refused Christianity and practiced pagan traditions, drank heavily, and sold weapons to the Massachusetts tribe, enemies of the Plymouth Wampanoag alliance. In 1628, Captain Standish led an expedition to arrest Marymount's leader, Thomas Morton. Morton and his most ardent supporters barricaded themselves in a building and prepared to exchange fire with Captain Standish's group. However, Morton and his friends were too drunk to fight. Captain Standish walked directly up to Morton and ripped his musket from his hands and arrested him. Thomas Morton was sent back to England and later wrote that he preferred Indians to Christians and called Captain Standish Captain Shrimp, possibly due to his alleged shorter stature. Regardless of his height, Captain Myles Standish's cunning and martial status as a warrior amongst the Indians kept peace treaties in place and threats at bay. As a pair, John Alden and Myles Standish's greatest accomplishment was undoubtedly the establishment of Duxbury, which is still a town today in Massachusetts. Previously, colonists were entitled to large plots of farmland, but lived separate from that land in smaller households within the main parameters of the colony. In 1632, through political cunning and perhaps faith as well, John Alden petitioned Governor Bradford to have the farmland in Duxbury designated as a separate church congregation in need of a separate minister. This was granted and allowed families to live on their farmland full-time, greatly expanding the amount of land each family owned. Duxbury was incorporated as an official separate town in 1637, and John was elected deputy to the general court. John and Myles then spent the rest of their lives developing the area. John Alden would go on to have 10 children, and Myles Standish 7. Both men have genealogical and historical societies dedicated to them, and are estimated to have 1 million modern descendants each. Their homesteads still stand today, and there are many towns, monuments, and buildings named for them. Their unrelenting spirit became the foundational culture of what it means to be an American, and it is the duty of all Americans to remember our forgotten founding fathers.